I get asked a lot, how did you get into aviation? Well, I wanted to take a few minutes to tell you my story. Where did good old Captain Steve come from? Was I born, or like most captains, was I forged from the fires of old? I was born. And hang out till the end, because I'm going to give you a sneak peek into my experience on September 11th, 2001, and you're not going to want to miss that story. Now, before I launch into my background, I want to give you a bit of a history from my family. The only problem with that is I just don't know anything about my family history. That is, until today's sponsor came to the rescue. MyHeritage is the #1 family history service. When I was born, both of my parents were both older, that is, later in life. I didn't even know what my grandparents' names were. But when I put my information into MyHeritage, I found out that my grandfather's name was Charles. It's a respectable name. And my grandmother's name was Augusta. I love that. They were only 20 and 18 when they had my dad in 1910. And on my mom's side, I found family going all the way back to the early 1800s. Thanks to the over 33 billion records MyHeritage has access to, I was able to easily piece together my family's story. I was really hoping to find out that I was related to the Wright brothers. I'm not. Hey, at least I'm not related to the Wrong brothers either. Visit the link in the description below to start a 14-day free trial and start building your family tree today. And thanks to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. This is a big part of what makes it possible for us to make content for you. Now, back to my story. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, from a transportation family. My mother and her whole side of the family was into the railroad forever. I think everybody as far back as I could find out worked for the railroad. I wanted to be an engineer, a train engineer, when I was a little kid. And in one sense, being an airplane captain is kind of like that. My father was a pianist. That means he was a professional piano player. He made a living playing the piano. I loved to watch airplanes take off and land when I was a little kid. I was your classic kid that whenever we would go to the airport, I would love to stand at the window and wave at the pilots. In fact, now that I am one, sometimes I find myself just waving to myself. That's a joke, but yeah, it would be fun to do. And it was fun when I was a little kid. So fast forward now to when I grow up and I've got to find a job finally. And I went to college and I had a great time in college, folks. And that showed in my grades for sure. And when I turned 22 and graduated from college, I needed a job. And the job market was kind of slow in 1982. I fumbled around with a couple of interviews. Didn't really find anything I wanted to do. My best friend had gone to the U.S. Naval Academy and he was about to become a naval flight officer, and he was going to get into flying. And I thought that really sounds like a great job. And so he talked me through it and he said, Steve, go down to the recruiter and tell him you want to be a pilot. So I rehearsed my lines and I went down to the recruiter and I walked in, and after all the small talk was over, the recruiter said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, well, I'd like to join the Navy and I'd like to be a pilot. And he looked at me and said, well, you and 40,000 other guys. And I said, well, I don't want 40,000 spots. I only want one. And he laughed. All right. He said, well, I like the attitude. He said, let's do this. He said, let's sign you up to take the tests. And there's a whole bunch of tests you have to take. And so I came in a couple weeks later and I took the whole battery of tests. They were called the AQTFAR. I don't know what they stand for. Don't ask me. But when I got done with those, about 3 weeks later, the phone rang and he said, hey, Steve, he goes, you did great on the tests. In fact, you aced the tests. I thought, aced sounds good, right? Pilot, ace, right? So he said, come on down here. Let's get your college transcript together. Let's see if we can get you that pilot spot that you want. And so I said, okay. So I went back down to the recruiter and I talked to him a little bit and I said, hey, is there any chance that we could skip the part about the college transcript? He said, no, we got to have that. And I said, well, really, you want to skip that? And he said, why? And I said, I had a good time in college. So he eventually gets my college transcript, puts together all of the tests that I had taken, and he looked at me and he shook his head and he goes, Steve, he goes, I can't send this package in. He goes, you don't have the grades to be a pilot. And I said, please. I kind of begged him. And he said, all right, I'll send it in, but I don't have much hope for you to get accepted. About 6 weeks later, the phone rings, and it's him. I had forgotten that I had even put a package in. About 6 weeks later, he calls me, and I pick up the phone, and his voice now is about 3 octaves higher, and he goes, you're not going to believe this. He goes, they accepted you. You better get down here right now. Now, why did they accept good old Steve back then, who had dubious grades in college? Well, because Ronald Reagan was president and they were going to double the size of the Navy. And for about a 3.5 to 4 year period, they lowered the standards to a point where a knucklehead like me with average grades, they weren't horrible, they were just average grades, could get in and become a pilot. And now the rest is history, my friends. It worked out pretty well. When I finally joined the Navy, I went to something that's called AOCS. If you've ever seen the movie An Officer and a Gentleman, that's the format of that movie. It was a movie with Richard Gere back in the 80s. And I went to that program. 16, 20 weeks later, something like that, I was done. I got commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy, and I went off to fly my first airplane. And the first airplane I flew was a little hot rod, a little single-engine turboprop called a T-34 Charlie. Beechcraft made that airplane. It was tandem seating. I sat in the front. The instructor sat behind me, had a little stick in the middle to fly. That thing was dynamite. Man, that was a great airplane. And the worst 15 seconds of my life was the first time I went flying in an airplane. Now remember, I had never been in an airplane before. I was actually at the controls flying it. And they told you to push up the power and push in a little right rudder because the prop's spinning and it's going to make you go to the left. And you push in the right rudder to stay straight down the runway. And at the designated time when the instructor behind you says rotate, you pull back on that stick about 6 inches or so. And then the airplane begins to lift off the ground and you start flying. And there's about a dozen things you need to do in the next 15 seconds. We'll get to that in a minute. So I push up the power. The airplane's shaking like crazy. I'm scared to death. Or we're going down the center of the runway. Remember, I've never gone from rolling to flying before. I don't know what that sensation is like. He says rotate. I pull back the 6 inches on the stick and we start climbing up. And I am so excited and so proud of myself. I'm like literally giving myself a high five up in the front seat. And now he's like, Steve, there's, again, a dozen things you have to do in the next 15 seconds. I missed them all. He gets the gear. He gets the flaps. He turns us off. Finally, I got caught up with the airplane. I was so excited. I had met what I was supposed to do for a living, and that's be a pilot. I was in love with it right from that moment on, and that was 41 years ago. So now you fly the T-34. That's primary training in the Navy. Then you choose at the end of primary training where you're going to go in the Navy. Are you going to fly helicopters? Are you going to fly props, which was an airplane in the Navy called a P-3 Orion or a C-130? That was a possibility. Or am I going to go fly jets, right? Like Tom Cruise and Top Gun. And Top Gun came out a couple of years after I was choosing my airplane in the Navy. So F-14s were in play back then. And the way it works when you select is they basically give you a blank piece of paper in front of you, and there's 3 lines on it. And you can write down in order what you would prefer. Jets if you want to go jets, props if you want to go props, helos if you want to go in any order that you want. If you want to fly helos, put that at the top because that's what you're going to get. Props was pretty competitive. Jets was the most competitive status. You had to have a certain grade point average in primary training to even write jets down at all. I had good enough grades to write down jets, but my wife and I had agreed that the family choice was the props, the P-3 Orion. And I sat there and I looked at that piece of blank paper in front of me and I thought, nobody on the planet will ever know what I write down. I could put jets down right now and just tell my wife, hey, they drafted me into jets. Who knew, right? But you know what? Good old Captain Steve is a rule keeper. And he had made an agreement with the fair and lovely Mrs. Captain Steve. And I stuck to my rule keeping. And I wrote props down on the first line and then jets and then helos. And I got P3s. And I loved my time in the P-3 Orion. It was a great airplane. It was the old Lockheed Electra back from the 1950s and early 60s. It was a submarine hunter. I loved the mission of hunting subs back during the Soviet Union days. We would track their submarines. It was a real mission in real time. I loved flying around with a crew of 12. That airplane was very versatile, very maneuverable, fast, fuel efficient. It was just everything. The autopilot didn't work, so you hand flew the airplane. I really got good at my pilot flying skills in the 15 years that I flew the P-3 Orion. Then I finally got hired at the airlines. And so when I went off in 1991 to get hired, I put in applications everywhere. I interviewed and I got a job offer. And the job offer I get was at the largest airline in the world at the time. I remember one of the interview questions they asked me is, why do you want to work at this airline? And I said, well, 30 years from now, I think there's going to be 3 airlines in at least in business 30 years from now, probably American, Delta, and United. And sure enough, a lot of airlines have come and gone over all of those years, but those 3 airlines are still around. And I wish I could tell you which airline I got hired by. I would love to, but I just don't on this channel. But I can say of the 3 major airlines that I just mentioned, how do I put this? It's a very, here in America, it's a very American type of airline, very apple pie, very grassroots, very Americana, if you know what I mean. So the first airplane I flew with that airline was a 727. I was a flight engineer. I was the third wheel up in the cockpit. Loved that airplane. The best of kind of the old world of flying. I was on that for about 6 months when I upgraded to the 767. Now, what made me decide to go from the 727 to the 767 while I was still on probation, and I probably shouldn't have, because I was risking my employment with that company. I was flying as the engineer one night, coming into Tampa, Florida. The captain ordered a coffee as we were about 5 minutes away from landing. The door opened up, a coffee came through. I handed it to the captain. He looked, and we were bouncing around in the airplane on final approach in bad weather. He said, I don't know why I ordered this coffee. He handed it back to me. He said, Steve, would you mind holding that? So I held it. But we were bouncing around so bad that most of the coffee spilled down on my sleeve. It ruined my shirt. When we got down on the ground, he felt bad. He said, I'm so sorry. I'll buy you a new shirt. And I thought, you know what? To myself, I thought, I'm not a coffee holder. I'm a pilot. I went right over to the computer and I put in my 767 application. And the next month I got into the 767 fleet. And I was on that airplane for 23 and a half years. And that leads me to the big part of the story where I teased you in the beginning about September 11th. If you remember, on September 11th, 2001, the 767 was the airplane of choice for the hijackers. It's the airplane that they had all trained on down in Florida, and all the airplanes that hijacked on that day were 767s. Now, I had been on that airplane, I think at that point, for about 8 years. I was based in Boston's Logan International Airport, and I was very close to the events of September 11th. In fact, I was on reserve up in Boston in those days, on call to fill in for another pilot if they couldn't make it for one reason or another. And the very first airplane to be hijacked on September 11th was American Airlines Flight 11. Did I say that out loud? And that airplane was the first airplane that flew into the First World Trade Center. I was originally scheduled to be the co-pilot on that airplane. But through an extraordinary set of circumstances, I got bumped by a more senior pilot the night before. So I was as close to the events of September 11th as you can possibly get. There's a film called In My Seat. It's on... we'll link it to you down below. It's a 15-minute documentary that tells you my story. This September 11th coming up, we're going to do a whole lead up, and I'm going to tell you much, much more of the story than I've ever told before. But I thought you would want to know that. That's good old Captain Steve's backstory. So after I got done on my time as a 767 first officer, 23 and a half years. I then upgraded to the right seat, first officer on the 777, where I was for about 6 years. I love that airplane. Unbelievable. And then about 5 years ago now, I upgraded to captain on the 777, and Captain Steve was born. And I went from the right seat to the left seat on the same airplane. I love that airplane so much. The check airman who finally checked me out as a first officer back about 10 years ago, said to me, Steve, he goes, the hardest part about flying the Boeing 777 is wiping the stupid grin off your face at the end of the day. And he was absolutely right. I love that airplane, and I love what I do for a living. Well, this has been a lot of fun, and a special thanks to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Now you're up to speed on how Captain Steve started and how we got to where we are today. There's lots more Captain Steve ahead for all of us. I'm Captain Steve. Fly safe.